welcome to Dotting the Iron Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob, and this is episode 11. This week, I want to talk about the trope that all of the impressive stuff that ancient races ever did were done by aliens, but before we get to that, some quick housekeeping. Last week, I wrote a blog post about getting some sleep. On Tuesday, a free flash fiction story called The Watchmen, where sometimes you should be afraid of the dark. I did a review of the Terminator franchise in light of the new Dark Fate movie 6/3 retcon whatever rubbish that's coming out soon, and my Patreon exclusive flash fiction was called Sickness from the prompt Lightspeed Sickness. Next week there'll be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. It was a pretty busy week this week. Really close to finally being up to date, even though I've been saying that for the last number of weeks. This week I've got no commitments on the weekend, so I can push as hard as I need to get everything caught up, and I've got a bunch of other work that I want to get done this week because I want this to be a big week. I'm recording this on Thursday, which means I'm officially 6 days behind, which is the closest that I've been so far. So tomorrow when I get home from work, I'll probably sleep, but then when I get up, try and get all the writing done and try and record a podcast tomorrow night as well and be completely up to date before the end of the day on Friday. One thing that has become clear this week is that as the podcast goes on and I ramble more and more into the microphone, I'm finding that I'm coming back to the same points of view, and the topics that I initially chose for the podcast, I just did a Google search of like what are the most common science fiction tropes, and then any that I found interesting I put into a list, and that's what I'm working from. But what I'm finding about as I'm talking about them is it's not just important to talk about them, but it's also important to talk about whether or not they're good for science fiction. They're good for fiction as a whole. And this comes back to why I think that stories are important, and it turns out that I've been talking about this the whole time and I just haven't really realized it. What I'm finding that I'm coming back to is basically saying that culture is a part of humanity. It's an extension from previous generations, and that extending culture into the future is very important, and that's the core reason why I like to write stories. Culture and these stories that we build into the future is a sort of external hard drive that humans have been using to hold information outside of the brains of each generation. It's a way of telling morals and cautionary tales that are important for each generation to learn in a way that just directly connects to the way that we learn about the universe around us. It's a way to explore things the same way that we need to explore over that yonder hill, which is a huge part of what sci-fi is always about, exploring the next big thing. It's also, like, stories are also a way of exploring ourselves. It keeps bringing me back to the concept of the monomyth, which is something that was talked about by Carl Jung, but I think it was probably best exemplified in The Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. The idea that the hero's journey can be found in all cultures around the world, even cultures that have been historically very separated. And so you'd think, considering how far the other aspects of culture have diverged, that would also diverge. But apparently there is something about the hero's journey that humans want to tell to each other. It's something that we have found is very useful for telling each other how things should be and what we should strive for, and how to unearth new information, and how we have to go off into the unexpected world and find new tools and allies and come back with new strengths and new information about how to defeat the far-off dragons. So I found the aspect of putting my thoughts out, even though it's been mostly rambling about other things, that my mind keeps coming back to this through line of why I'm spending so much time telling stories. I mean, as yet, I haven't really earned any money from spending this amount of time. I could have been doing copy editing work and earning money through writing. I could have dedicated more time to looking for a better job or spending my time on more productive things than writing random things to put on my website and recording this is episode 11. They're all about a half an hour long, so 6.5 hours of podcast, which is starting to really add up to be a decent amount. And so I find that it's been really interesting for me to think about it as I'm going through the day, thinking about what I'm going to put on the podcast this week, how I keep coming back to this sort of concept that stories are important and there really is a reason why I write them. So it's been very interesting for me, and I hope that it's been interesting for you as a listener, and I'm going to try and focus more intently now that I understand what my own theme is, which, as a writer, your theme isn't always as obvious as you think it is when you start writing a story. So it's not something that I find remarkable that it turns out that I've actually been saying something that was important, something that I implicitly knew but wasn't explicitly expressing. That's what most second drafts are for, honing in on what you were actually saying the first time. Also this week, I've redone my Patreon structure. I've made it a little bit more streamlined and simple, because I think it was just too complicated. I've changed the concept of my old Wall of Awesome, which I've referred to several times, talking about the Patreon, to the new heraldic list of awesome, where the upper tiers can have their own sigils, and I think it's a nice way to engage with an audience. I've seen other people on YouTube that do something. It's an idea that's similar to something that one of the YouTubers that I watch does. So I thought it'd be fun to add it in, and hopefully it's at least interesting and engaging. Speaking of Patreon, I'd like to put a big thanks to the people that have supported me on Patreon. Everyone who is or has supported me will get their name on the heraldic list of awesome. There's currently, for even $1 a month, you'll get access to 13 exclusive Patreon stories with a new one added each week. Larger subscriptions gets you access to other work that I've got coming up, or even to be specifically named and thanked during the podcast. Speaking of, the most coveted spot of all of the patrons is the position of King. The King of Awesome is the first amongst the patrons. This person has proven to be the most awesome fan of my work and is recognised as such. And for this week, the King of Awesome is Zevin Art, who has been a long-running king, but he can be knocked off of his crown by people contributing and being generally awesome. If you like what I do but you can't help me out through Patreon, feel free to spread the word. Putting reviews of the podcast or just telling a friend who you think might be interested in science fiction is a huge help to me. And of course, if you really want to go all out, feel free to build a giant space laser and use it to burn my website URL into the face of the moon. I really appreciate everyone who's supported me, and I really hope that I've made your day a little bit better. The topic for this week is the trope that all of the impressive and cool stuff that was built in the past was actually built by aliens. The flag bearer for this trope, I suppose, is the Stargate series, with the underlying mythos that these ancient aliens actually built all of the pyramids as landing platforms for their spaceships. There's a reason that this is a conspiracy, and that reason is humans see dodgy patterns and they find it hard to believe that people in the past were smarter than them. From an evolutionary standpoint, if you were to grab any human out of time from any point in the last 100 to 150,000 years and plonk them in the middle of modern day, they're just as capable of learning and just as capable of understanding as anybody else. They just don't have the access to this exterior hard drive that I was talking about in the start of the podcast. They don't have all this culture and information that they're being given as they're growing up to acclimatize into the modern world. But when it comes to intelligence, they're just as intelligent as any modern human. When you look into history, you see that before the turn of the Julian calendar, 0 BCE, the ancient Greek civilization already knew that the Earth and the Moon were spheres. They'd already invented geometry and geography. Pythagoras had already determined the relationship between a lot of those geometric shapes, but more specifically had already invented the Pythagorean theorem. Empires had already taken over China and most of Europe. Trade between nations had extended far beyond the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria, which was destroyed in Caesar's time, so pre-44 BC, was probably one of the biggest black marks on history because it contained a lot of the original works copies of the original works of the ancient Greek philosophers who, when we see works by Aristotle and Socrates and Sophocles and all these people who had fantastic ideas that have shaped the Western civilization, it's a shame to think that they only really survived because they'd been copied into other cultures and it took us a long time to get them back. They very nearly were lost to history, and how much longer would the Dark Ages have gone on had we not had access to the fact that Western civilizations had already solved a lot of the problems that we were only just now solving. In the case of the pyramids, Egyptologists over the last 100 years have found that the old myth that the pyramids were built by slaves is actually false. Well, slaves were involved, but actually the people who did most of the work that made the pyramids work the way that they do were tradies, people who were trained in a skill of how to move things, how to create their correct geometric shapes for stability, how to lay things out. I have no doubt that they had access to methods that have been lost to time that allowed them to do all of these things. We know that they were able to notice and understand important things like astrology and the seasons because they lined their monuments up so that they were in line with specific dates on the calendar. And in prehistory, long ago, the Aboriginals of Australia came to the Australian shores. Now, for a long time, there was thought that there must have been a land bridge, but as we've learned about continental drift, we realise that the distance was actually used to be further because the Australasian shelf is actually moving north into the Asian shelf. And so 40 to 80,000 years ago, when the Aboriginals were coming over to Australia, the distance was actually further. The seas would have been higher and rougher, and definitely there would not have been a point in time where the seas were ever low enough to be able to walk from one continent to the other. So it seems clear that 60,000 years ago or thereabouts, there was a civilization somewhere in Asia that had access to boats that were able to travel in deep seas, that once they reached Australia and they found the incredible bounty of animals that had no idea that humans were predators, there was so much bounty that they didn't need the ability to sail anymore, and they lost that skill. They regressed due to the significant amount of bounty that they found when they reached the Australian shores, because the arrival of the Aboriginals is also the same time when the Australian megafauna mysteriously disappeared and went extinct. There used to be a number of megafauna that lived on the Australian continent, like giant kangaroos, giant wombats, giant other things. And with the introduction of the Aboriginal culture, pretty quickly, these things who had no notion of needing to be wary of mankind found themselves eaten by it. And the Aboriginals very quickly spread across the entire nation due to the abundance. In more recent times, the Polynesians arrived at New Zealand approximately 800 whatever years ago, at around 1200 AD, I think, unless I'm wrong. Feel free to Google it. But they haven't been on New Zealand for a massive amount of time. I wouldn't want to hang around for that amount of time, but they haven't been around for like the length of time when we think about civilizations in comparison to like how long the Egyptians have been on the River Nile, or how long the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent has been inhabited. New Zealand hasn't been inhabited that long, but the Polynesians who've come down from northern smaller islands have needed to have the ability to navigate and be able to sail quite deep seas in order to come down and do that, and that's 600 years before England and Spain and that were building ships that were capable of doing it successfully. Early ships that were going to America in the 1450s had a massive loss rate. It took, another 200 years before ship travel between the European lands and the American colonies was reliably safe-ish, except for the development of, meteorology to determine when there were going to be massive storms that would just murder everyone no matter how good your sailboats were. While we're still on sailboats, we know the Vikings created ships that were capable of crossing really deep water and able to navigate using a method where they could tell what latitude they were. It was a really early sextant that allowed them to travel east or west with relatively good accuracy, which allowed them to go to Greenland and Newfoundland and Iceland and America at the 800 AD period, which is crazy when you think about it. And that's why the trope persists. The trope that people in the past couldn't possibly have been smart enough or skilled enough to be able to do these great things. The ancient wonders are considered wonders because they couldn't possibly have been built by humans, except for the fact that they're all constructions typically built out of stone or metals that people had access to be able to craft at the time. So it's not unreasonable to think that with incredible surplus and wealth that a state might be able to come together to build these great things. When you go down the list, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are seen as this incredible feat to be able to build these gardens in an area which is now desert, but it wouldn't have been in 600 BC. It would have been quite fertile, we know, because of how many people were living there. It was built in Babylon, which is between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which is considered to be the cradle of civilization. Of course, there was enough space there and enough wealth of atmosphere and water to be able to build a gigantic garden for a culture that would have been entirely reliant on agriculture. So they probably would have had some pretty skilled farmers that would have been able to build such a thing. As I mentioned before, the Great Pyramid of Giza and the other pyramids were not built by random people who just didn't have enough time on their hands. They were concerted efforts of state built by very wealthy people and made by people that were incredibly skilled in what they were doing. Looking at all 5 of the others, which are all Greek wonders, the Temple of Artemis, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, these are all just big buildings or big statues that were built by people at the peak of their ability to make stonework. Yes, they were all built relatively close together between 280 BC and 550 BC, depending on things. But I find it unremarkable that cultures that have spent the majority of their time focusing on building stone temples and houses, that they wouldn't have anyone come up with the ability to build a large statue or a large mausoleum or a large lighthouse that was capable of inspiring incredible awe. I mean, the reason for building things that inspired incredible awe is your enemies leave you the hell alone if they think that you're too great to be conquered. So it's not like they didn't have a motivation to self-aggrandize their cities with these incredible works And I mean from a very pragmatic point of view, the expenditure of money into the economy of those places, shifting money from the upper class into the middle class, would have been a really good way to get votes. A lot of those places, Greece was all democracy at that time, so, it probably would have been a pretty good idea to say, oh, hey, all the stoneworkers, there's a lot of you, well, I'll sling you some cash to build this giant eyesore, and you vote for me. So, maybe that's too pragmatic. Now that I've said that I think that it's plausible that people in the past did what people in the past did, I think it's time to turn to whether or not this trope is a good trope to see in science fiction. Should we see aliens that have made all of the things in the past that are incredible? Well, I think we should see aliens who have achieved their own marvels, and that we shouldn't diminish our own marvels. I know the appeal of the intrigue or the sort of thrill of conspiracy to have it turn out that historical stories are rewritten where some character that we know was involved in their manufacture of events. They're called faux historical stories that come up on Doctor Who, where the Doctor goes back and is involved in making sure that some event that happened in history actually happens in history. And there's a great couple of episodes that were in Red Dwarf where they go back and happen to force the Kennedy assassination to occur. I think they initially stop it, and then it turns out that things became much worse. And if I remember rightly, the Stephen King book, whatever date it is, 1963, where there's the time portal and the guy goes back and he makes changes, and it ends up being that changing time is really difficult and you don't always get the outcome that you're hoping for. But in the same vein, this is the same kind of thing. The making turn out that aliens came down and gifted us information is the same thing as gods came down and gifted us with information. And I think, honestly, we've grown out of both of those ideas. Everything that we have as humans, we hold on to with our stories and our culture, and we pass that on to our next generations by retelling the good stories and getting rid of the bad ones. A child born on Earth today is more likely to have running water and sanitary conditions than not. While poverty is still a problem, it has significantly diminished and continues to diminish due to the work of, some great people and organizations. A child born today is the least likely in history to grow up hungry or to have any issues with scarcity of food. And yes, there are definitely places in the world where there still are those problems, but the majority of humans born today will never face those. Society that we live in today stands as a monument of the incredible work that has been put into the generations before us to be able to build up what we have today, the knowledge that we have today of how things work. A child born this year is probably going to know how electricity works before they're 15. It took human civilization hundreds of thousands of years to work that out. And now you just get that information. You can just look it up on the internet. You can just be taught it at school, which in a lot of places in the world is a forced human right to be educated. So what I'm saying is we should probably try and shy away from telling people that humans in the past were not as good as humans today, because it's a bad trope. And in a way, it is also saying that we're better than our parents, or that we're better than other people in time, which we're not. They just had different choices to us. When you look around today at what's going on in the space industry and the fact that in the next 10 years there could be a man on Mars, that to me tells me everything I need to know about the capacity for humans to do big and great things. SpaceX was founded in 2002. It hasn't even been 20 years, and there's a good chance by 2022 that a big Falcon rocket will land on Mars. It probably won't have anyone on it in 2022. But, I mean, they're in the middle of building it. They've had some test flights with some of the rockets that are needed. In another 3 years, when the 2022 window opens to go to Mars, there's I'd say a better than 50-50 chance that a BFR rocket will be flying to Mars. And definitely by 2024 there'll be one. I feel like the chance of there being a BFR rocket flying to Mars in 2024 has got to be better than 95%. You know, I think it's definitely better than 50% in 2022, but 3 years for development it seems like a long time, but it really isn't. I mean, in between the first flight of the Falcon Heavy the Falcon 9 in 2000 and I'm trying to remember. I think it was 2011 was the first flight of the Falcon 9. And in 2015 in December was the first time that we were able to do the vertical landing of the first stage. So that was a huge thing. That was an incredible turn in space technology of proving that this massive amount of money could be saved by reusability in an industry where we've been told that we can't do that. To potentially go from having the idea to start a space business to landing a gigantic rocket on the face of Mars in 22 years seems like only aliens could have done it. Maybe Elon Musk is an alien. I really don't think so. He's made too many human mistakes. Alright, next week on Tuesday, the prompt for my Tuesday story is, are you serious about dieting? On Wednesday, I'm planning to do a review of Jurassic Park, although that might change because I'm going to see the new movie Ad Astra on the weekend, so it might be an Ad Astra hot take and I might put Jurassic Park in the bag for another time. The Thursday story will be written from the prompt Space Colony, and the topic for next week's episode of the podcast is Time Travel's Totally Okay because blank. If you'd like to send me a suggestion of a prompt, if you want to challenge my brain, see if you can think of two ideas that seem contradictory and difficult to put together, you can email me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter at boblynchbsc. Feel free to hit me up if you've got a prompt for a story or a comment or a question, or you just want to tell me how rubbish I am as a writer or a podcast maker. Which is true. I mean, I'm definitely learning on the job. But if you like what I do and you want to check out more of my work, you can head to patreon.com/RobertLynch, where you can access some Patreon exclusive stuff that I do and help me to keep the lights on, keep the website hosted, keep the podcast hosted, and dedicate more time to writing hopefully interesting and fun stories. Now, as always, you can check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.